The night the Hale estate filled with white orchids and old money, nobody noticed the woman refilling their glasses, and that's exactly how Maren Whitlock survived. 27 years old, hair pinned back, hands rough from 2 jobs and 4 hours of sleep. She'd learned long ago that the safest place in a dangerous house is the corner everyone forgets to look at. She wasn't there for the champagne or the diamonds dripping off the guests. She was there for the paycheck that kept her 16-year-old sister's failing heart beating 1 more month. But Maren had a gift. The powerful never respected she could read a room like a loaded gun. And tonight every instinct she owned was screaming. Because the bride-to-be on Casper Hale's arm, the most feared man in Chicago, wasn't smiling at him like a woman in love. She was smiling like a woman counting down. And when that beautiful, polished fiancé suddenly turned and hurled a full glass of red wine straight into the maid's face, the entire ballroom went still. 300 guests. A crime lord who hadn't flinched at death in 20 years. All of them frozen. Because the quiet girl didn't cry, didn't run, didn't even wipe her cheek. She just looked at the most dangerous man in the room and said 6 words that none of them were ready to hear. If a story about courage, buried secrets, and the kind of love nobody saw coming speaks to you, hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that the quietest person in the room is often the bravest. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story that stays with you. Now, let's go back to the moment that glass left her hand, because what happened in the next 60 seconds changed everything. Red wine streamed from Maren's eyebrow down to her chin, dripping onto the collar of her white uniform, yet she stood perfectly still, her eyes never leaving Casper Hale's face at the far end of the banquet table. In that thick, suffocating silence, where 300 people seemed to be holding their breath, she spoke, not trembling, not loud, just clearly enough for the most powerful man in the room to hear. Don't drink that glass. The warning fell like 6 stones, thrown into the still surface of a lake. Delphine Voss burst out laughing. A sharp, bright laugh, the kind of sound carefully practiced until it seemed natural in rooms filled with elegant people. She turned toward the guests, her diamond-covered hands spreading open as though she were explaining herself to the entire world. "This girl has lost her mind," Delphine said, her voice laced with false pity so skillfully shaped it almost sounded real. "She spilled an entire tray of wine on me, and now she's standing here making things up. I'm sorry, everyone. This house should have screened the staff more carefully." A few strained laughs rose here and there. A few eyes turned away, embarrassed on behalf of the soaked maid standing frozen where she was. But Maren didn't look at Delphine. She hadn't once taken her eyes off Casper, and that was what began to shift the air inside the room. Because the man seated at the head of the table didn't laugh with the others, didn't wave the matter aside, didn't order anyone to throw her out. Casper Hale sat motionless, the wineglass still in his hand. His long fingers tightened around the stem of the crystal. He had lived long enough in a world where death often came wearing the loveliest smiles, long enough to learn that the only person worth trusting in a room was the one who had nothing to gain. And this girl, this maid whose face he had only vaguely remembered throughout the evening, was looking at him with something he rarely saw in the people who circled him. Not fear of humiliation, not calculation, only the naked urgency of someone who knew she was about to lose everything because she had opened her mouth. Delphine laid one hand on his wrist, soft, possessive. "Darling, don't let a servant ruin our evening," she whispered. But beneath that sweet voice ran a taut thread only Maren, from where she stood, could hear. Casper slowly turned his head to look at his fiancée, then looked back at the maid, his eyes moving between the 2 women like a blade searching for a seam. No one in the entire room dared to move. The string music in the corner had gone silent without anyone noticing when it stopped. Another waiter stood frozen with a tray of pastries in his hands. Maren felt her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole room could hear it. But she didn't take a single step back, because she knew the moment she retreated would be the moment that man died. Casper set the wineglass down on the table, slowly, without making a sound, then lifted his right hand to shoulder height and lightly snapped 2 fingers together. It was so small a gesture that anyone not paying attention would have missed it, but from the shadows along the wall, a tall man in a black suit immediately separated himself from the line of bodyguards and stepped forward. It was Bishop Crane, Casper's right hand, a 44-year-old man with a face as cold as if it had been carved from stone and eyes that hadn't missed a thing for as long as he had stood behind his boss. Casper didn't raise his voice. He merely tipped his head toward the glass that was still full and let out one sentence, his voice low and even enough to chill the blood. "Test it." Delphine froze for half a second. Only half a second. But Marin caught the instant when her smile stiffened at the corner of her mouth before it was pulled back into place. "Are you joking?" Delphine said. And this time her laugh had already begun to crack. "You're really going to listen to a dishwasher instead of trusting me?" Casper didn't answer her. He kept looking at Marin, and in that cold, cutting gaze, for the first time, there was something else. Not trust. It was far too soon to call it trust, but a question opening like an abyss beneath everyone's feet in that room. Bishop picked up the glass, held it toward the chandelier light, gently swirled the dark red liquid inside, and all 300 people in the room held their breath together, waiting for the answer none of them was ready to face. But to understand why a maid would dare to stand among 300 people and warn the most dangerous man in Chicago, one had to go back nearly 1 year, to the moment Marin Whitlock stepped through the iron gates of the Hale mansion with a thin file in her hands and a despair so heavy she thought it had already become part of her flesh. Marin hadn't been born into poverty. She had fallen into it, slowly, in the way illness wears down an ordinary family until nothing is left. Her mother died after 2 years of fighting a cancer that had crept all the way into her bones, and those final months hadn't only taken away the woman who had raised her, they had swallowed every dollar of savings, every object that could be sold, every sliver of hope her father had once possessed. The man didn't last long after the funeral. One morning, he left a few small bills on the kitchen table, and a note so short it felt cruel, then vanished from the lives of his 2 daughters as if he had never been there at all, leaving young Marin to suddenly become the sole breadwinner for her teenage sister, with a stack of hospital bills so high she had to read the number again and again before she could believe it. $80,000, a row of digits hanging over her head like a blade. Posy, her younger sister, had been born with an imperfect heart, a defect in one of the valves that made every climb up the stairs a moment when Marin stood watching without breathing, and the doctor had made it clear that without surgery, every passing month was a debt borrowed from a future the girl might never be able to repay. So Marin did everything that could be done. She took extra night shifts at a roadside diner on the south side of the city, wiped down tables for truck drivers at 3 o'clock in the morning, then went home to sleep for a few hours, before putting on another uniform. And she learned one thing. Poverty teaches everyone forced to live inside it, that to survive beside people who could decide her fate, she had to learn how to read them. She read the diner manager's face to know which days she should ask for more hours and which days she should keep quiet. She read the voice of the debt collector on the phone to know when the threat was real and when it was only a script. She even read the look in Posy's eyes every morning to know whether the girl had struggled to breathe the night before, though Posy always smiled and said she was fine. That ability wasn't a gift from heaven. It was a skill sharpened by fear, a kind of sense that only those who always stood below, always had to look upward to measure the moods of people stronger than themselves, could develop to such a degree. When the notice appeared for a housekeeper for a private family in the North Shore area, Marin knew at once that something wasn't normal, because the salary listed there was 3 times higher than anywhere she had ever worked. So high it seemed absurd for cleaning and serving work. During the brief interview with a stern middle-aged woman named Hollis, no one asked about her past. No one requested a letter of recommendation. No one cared where she came from or what she had been through, and that deliberate silence told Marin she was walking into the house of the kind of people who didn't need to explain themselves to anyone. She understood the rumors surrounding the Hale name very well. She understood that the money paying her might have passed through hands she didn't dare imagine. But when she looked down at the figure of $80,000 and thought of Posy's weakly beating heart inside their cramped apartment, she nodded and accepted the job without asking one more question. She told herself she would enter, work, collect her wages, and become the most invisible thing in that house, a quiet shadow slipping through gilded hallways without leaving a trace, hearing nothing, seeing nothing, knowing nothing. She had promised herself that for nearly 1 year, and she had kept that promise until the fateful night, until her eyes, trained to read people, accidentally touched upon something she never should have seen. What Marin had accidentally seen had to do with the man who owned that house, and to understand how dangerous that was, one had to understand who Casper Hale was in the underworld that most of Chicago only dared mention in whispers. At 37, Casper controlled a network that stretched from the docks along Lake Michigan to transportation companies, warehouses, and businesses that looked clean on paper, while beneath them ran currents of money. No one dared trace back to their source, and he ran it all with a cold discipline that made even the most ruthless men wary. People feared him not because he often lost his temper, but because he almost never did. Rage was a luxury for men who could still be surprised by betrayal, and Casper had stopped being surprised a long time ago. Maren had witnessed that once, around her 4th month working in the mansion, when she'd been assigned to bring a tray of coffee down to the wine cellar and had accidentally turned into the wrong corridor, the one leading to a sealed room the staff had been told never to approach. The door was cracked open, and through the narrow gap, she saw a man kneeling on the stone floor. Someone who had once belonged to Casper, someone who had sold information about a shipment to a rival faction in exchange for money. Casper didn't shout, didn't beat him, didn't leave a single drop of blood on the floor. He simply sat in a leather chair, both elbows resting on his knees, listening to the man beg for nearly 10 minutes with a patience more frightening than any roar. And then he stood, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and said in a low, even voice that the traitor would be allowed to live, would leave the city within 48 hours, and would never again let Casper hear his name. It was that restraint that made Bishop Crane and the rest of them loyal unto death, because they understood that a man who could kill and chose not to was far more dangerous than a man who killed because he'd lost control. Maren had stood frozen behind the door that night, the coffee tray trembling in her hands, and she'd understood that this man wasn't cruel in a chaotic way. He was cruel according to a set of rules, and rules were always more terrifying because they couldn't be moved by pleading. No one in the mansion truly knew where Casper came from, but the fragments that fell from the stories of the older bodyguards painted the image of an orphaned child raised in neighborhoods where kindness was a deadly luxury, a boy who had once trusted someone and had paid for that trust with scars no $1,000 tailored suit could ever fully hide. People said the man who had lifted him up when he was young had also been the first man to betray him, and that lesson had frozen something inside Casper, turning him into a windowless fortress, a man who owned everything yet truly belonged to no one, who ate dinner alone in a room large enough for 50 people, who walked through hallways hung with expensive paintings without ever letting his eyes rest on anything. And yet, in the middle of all that coldness, there was one line Casper had never crossed, one unwritten clause in his private code that even his enemies had to acknowledge. He never touched the innocent, not unrelated women, not servants who only kept their heads down and did their work, not anyone standing outside the game he had chosen. It wasn't kindness. He would have been the first to deny it if anyone dared call it that. It was the last shred of honor left in a man who had lost nearly everything else, the one fragile border keeping him from becoming exactly the kind of monster that had made him. And that very line, that cold code of honor no one would have expected, would become the only reason he was willing to tilt his head and listen to the 6 words spoken from the mouth of a maid, soaked in red wine on that fateful night. That line of honor might never have crossed Maren's life at all if not for an ordinary afternoon several months before the fateful night, when she was assigned to serve at the master's private dinner. She entered the dining room with a water pitcher in her hands, quiet as always, filled the crystal glass beside Casper's plate without spilling a single drop, then stepped back into the shadowed corner where she had always belonged, ready to disappear from the sight of those seated at the table. But that time, something that had never happened before happened. Casper lifted his head from the file he was reading. His eyes rested on her for exactly 1 moment, and then he said, "Thank you, Maren," his voice deep and calm, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Those 2 simple words made her stop in the middle of a step. In nearly 1 year of becoming a shadow inside this house, no one in their position had ever called her by name, because to the kind of people who lived behind gold-plated iron gates, people like Maren were only part of the furnishings, a nameless hand that filled a water glass and disappeared. Yet the coldest man among all of them, the man the whole city feared, remembered her name, the name embroidered in tiny letters on the breast of her uniform, a name she had thought no one would bother to glance at. She didn't understand why that made her heart beat 1 pace faster, and she immediately forced herself to snuff out the feeling, lowered her head in a soft reply, and withdrew. To Casper, it was only an old habit, a remnant of the private code he had set for himself, the habit of remembering the names of those who served him as a silent way of never becoming the sort of man who treated those beneath him as invisible, though even he didn't realize he was doing it. But not everyone in the room saw that moment as meaningless. At the far end of the table, Delphine Voss, who had recently moved into her private wing of the estate, following their high-profile engagement after 2 years of dating, set down her fork, and her beautiful, Perfectly made-up eyes slid from Casper to the maid, retreating into the dark corner. A look that lasted less than a second, but was so cold, Maren felt it touch the back of her neck like a breath of ice. Maren didn't understand why a woman about to marry the most powerful boss in Chicago, a dazzling beauty who had everything in her hands, would care about 2 words of thanks given to a dishwasher, but the sense sharpened by fear inside her immediately registered the strangeness of it and stored it away in some drawer of memory. The relationship between Casper and Delphine, beneath the surface of perfect photographs and an engagement diamond as large as a pea, wasn't the kind of love their parties tried so hard to display. Maren had watched long enough to recognize that through the small details no one else noticed, through the way the two of them spoke to each other in the tone of 2 partners discussing a contract rather than 2 people in love, through the fact that Casper never touched Delphine like a man consumed by desire, and Delphine never looked at him like a woman who was sincere. It was a marriage arranged as an alliance, 2 families, 2 powers, 2 calculations meeting at a point of mutual benefit, and both of them understood the rules of the game so well that there was no need to pretend when there was no audience. Casper entered it with the indifference of a man who had stopped believing love was something meant for him, seeing the marriage only as a move to reinforce power, a contract signed with rings instead of pens. He didn't love Delphine, and he had never pretended to himself that he did. But precisely because he was so used to expecting sincerity from no one, Casper didn't realize that the woman sitting beside him every evening, the woman who was about to put on the Hale name, was hiding behind that flawless smile, something far colder than his indifference, something only the eyes of an invisible maid ever had the chance to see. What the maid's eyes saw came on an evening only 3 days before the engagement party, when Hollis assigned Maren to clean the wing of rooms reserved for Delphine on the 2nd floor, a task she had done dozens of times, without ever thinking this time would be any different. She knocked on the door according to the rules, heard no answer, and because she knew Delphine usually went downstairs at this hour to have tea with Casper, she gently opened the door and stepped inside with the cart holding fresh towels and cleaning supplies. The room was steeped in soft golden light, the bathroom door was left slightly ajar, and the sound of running water came from within, so Maren guessed Delphine was in there. She meant to work quickly and withdraw before the woman came out. But as she rounded the vanity table to pick up a towel that had fallen to the floor, she heard Delphine's voice drifting out from the bathroom, and at once she understood she shouldn't be here. That voice held none of the sweetness of the woman who smiled at parties. It was low, hurried, sharp with coldness, and it was speaking in a language mixed with strange coded words Maren couldn't fully understand, phrases that sounded like passwords, numbers, and a name she dimly recognized as the name of the coming party. Maren stood frozen, her hand still gripping the towel, and she should have left right then. But fear pinned her feet to the floor, the primitive fear of a small animal that knows it has wandered into the den of something far more dangerous. Right in front of her, on the vanity, Delphine's velvet-covered jewelry box was open, and among the gold necklaces and glittering diamond bracelets lay something that didn't belong there at all. A small black handgun nestled inside the lining, its cold barrel reflecting the light. Beside it was a folded piece of paper that had been opened, and Maren's eyes, trained to read everything quickly, only had time to skim a few hurried handwritten lines before her mind could order her to look away. Just a few broken words, enough to build an image in her head that turned her blood cold. Casper's name, the words wineglass, the timing of the party, and one short, chilling sentence about someone's men coming in through the rear gate when the lights in the banquet hall were lowered. She didn't need to understand all those coded words to understand the meaning of what lay before her eyes, because the combination of a gun, hidden in a jewelry box, a voice whispering in code, and a fragment of a plan mentioning the man who was about to marry this woman could lead to only one truth, and that truth was so enormous. Maren felt the whole room tilt beneath her feet. The sound of water in the bathroom suddenly stopped. That abrupt silence snapped Maren out of her daze, and with the reflexes of someone accustomed to living in fear, she stepped back, pushed the cleaning cart toward the door with hands trembling so badly she nearly knocked over the stack of towels, trying to look as though she had only just entered and had seen nothing at all. But just as she touched the doorknob, the bathroom door opened behind her, and in the large mirror hanging on the wall, Maren's eyes accidentally met Delphine's. It was only an instant, so brief that later she would wonder whether she had imagined it. But in that fraction of a second, she saw the calm smile on the woman's face freeze solid, and behind all that perfect silk and velvet, Something sharp as a blade flashed and was immediately hidden away. Marin lowered her head, murmured an apology for disturbing her, hurried the cart out of the room, and closed the door behind her, her heart pounding like a frantic drum, and she knew, with every instinct that had kept her alive for years, that Delphine had just seen the thing Marin feared most, that she had seen. That night, Marin returned to the cramped apartment she shared with her sister on the south side of the city, without being able to remember how she had made the journey, her legs moving by instinct while her mind remained trapped in the room on the second floor of the mansion, still seeing the black gun lying among the diamonds, still hearing that coded voice whispering behind the half-closed door. She lay down on the narrow bed beside Posey's room, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, a struggle began in the darkness, and lasted until the sky beyond the window turned from black to gray. One half of her screamed that this wasn't her business, that she was only the cleaning girl, that whatever happened among powerful people in that world was beyond the reach and beyond the responsibility of a poor girl who was only trying to keep her sister alive, that the only wise thing to do was forget everything, keep her head down, work a few more months until she had saved enough money, then leave that house without ever looking back. But the other half of her wouldn't be silent, because she knew exactly what she had seen meant, knew that if she said nothing, then in 3 days a man would die in the very party meant to celebrate his happiness, and no matter who that man was, no matter what things stained his hands that she didn't dare think about, knowing in advance that a human being was going to die, and choosing silence would turn her into something she didn't want to become. She thought of her mother, the woman who had taught her that there were lines people mustn't cross no matter how poor they were, and she wondered what her mother would say to her on this night if she were still alive. Then she thought of Posey, and that was when real fear closed its hands around her throat, because she understood that if she opened her mouth, the first person to pay the price might not be her, but the younger sister, sleeping quietly behind that thin wall, the sister with the fragile heart who was all Marin had left in the world. Delphine had seen her. That woman knew she had seen something, and people willing to kill a crime boss to get what they wanted would never hesitate before a maid and her 16-year-old sister. Speaking meant placing both their fragile lives on the scale in exchange for the life of a stranger who owed her nothing. Silence meant safety, meant continuing to be invisible, meant giving Posey a chance to have surgery and go on living. The coldest logic told her she had to choose silence, and for hours she tried to persuade herself to do exactly that. But every time she almost managed to convince herself, a small fragment of memory surfaced without being invited. The 2 words, "Thank you, Marin," spoken in that deep, calm voice in the dining room that day, the way that cold man had seen her when his whole world chose not to look, had called her by her proper name when she had grown used to being a nameless shadow. She didn't understand why such a tiny detail clung to her so stubbornly, didn't understand why it made her feel as though she owed some vague debt she had never borrowed, a thin thread tying her to the man who had been sentenced to death without knowing it. By the time the first light of dawn slipped through the gap in the curtains, Marin still didn't have a definite answer, only a truth she couldn't deny growing larger inside her chest, that no matter which road she chose, the girl who woke up this morning would no longer be the invisible girl who had closed her eyes the night before, and that there were some things, once seen, that could never be unseen by shutting one's eyes and pretending they had never been there. 3 days passed in a state stretched tight as a violin string, and Marin still hadn't made her final decision when she stepped into the banquet hall that night in her serving uniform, swept into the machinery of preparing for an engagement celebration she knew was a trap about to snap shut. What she hadn't foreseen was that Delphine had made her own decision long before then. To Delphine, the maid who had caught sight of her in the mirror 3 days earlier was no longer a harmless pawn that could be ignored, but a dangerous variable that had to be neutralized before it had the chance to speak. And a professional like her understood that the most effective way to silence someone wasn't always murder, because a maid's body disappearing right before the party would bring questions she didn't want anyone asking on the most important night of her plan. There was another way, much more subtle, and that was to destroy the witness's credibility before the witness could open her mouth, to turn her into someone no one in that room would bother believing, not even for a single word. All evening, Delphine watched Marin from the corner of her eye, with the patience of a cat stalking prey already within reach of its claws, waiting for the exact moment when the maid came near her table, waiting for the instant when enough eyes were turned toward her, for the performance to have its greatest effect. Marin felt that cold attention pressing against the back of her neck all evening, and it only made her hesitate more. only made the warning she meant to speak lodge tighter in her throat, because she understood she was being watched, understood that every step she took tonight was within that woman's sight. And then the moment Delphine had been waiting for arrived, when Marin stepped close to clear the appetizer plates beside her seat, just as an important guest had lifted his glass in congratulations, and every face in that area was turned toward the couple about to be engaged. The splash of wine wasn't an impulsive act of jealousy, as the 300 people in the room hurried to interpret it. It was a move calculated down to the second, a cold first strike disguised as the anger of a difficult bride. In the few brief seconds after the dark red liquid struck the maid's face, Delphine had already attached the label she wanted to pin on Marin in front of every witness. A clumsy, careless servant, perhaps drunk or mentally unstable, someone whose every word afterward would be heard only as the babbling of a maid who had just committed a shameful mistake. It was a perfect trap, because if Marin cried or ran away, she would look exactly like the guilty figure Delphine had just created, and if Marin angrily argued back, she would look like an insolent girl who had lost control. No matter how she reacted, her credibility had already been destroyed before she could speak the truth. Delphine had calculated every possibility, had anticipated every ordinary reaction of a human being humiliated in public, and she was confident she had sealed every escape route for that dangerous maid. But there was one thing Delphine hadn't calculated, one variable outside every script her sharp mind had drawn, and that was that she had judged Marin by the measure meant for ordinary people, people who would collapse or lose their temper when shamed in front of a crowd. She didn't know that the girl standing before her had grown so used to being treated as invisible that a glass of wine thrown in her face no longer had enough force to break her. She didn't know that those eyes, sharpened by fear, had seen through her performance from the very first second. And most importantly, she didn't know that the very moment meant to drown Marin in humiliation was the moment that pushed the maid toward the decision she hadn't been able to make for the past 3 days. The decision that if she had been backed into a corner anyway, then she would go down speaking the truth, not in silence. Bishop Crane turned the glass beneath the chandelier light for one more second, then brought it closer to his nose, and Marin saw the stone-cold face of that man shift almost imperceptibly. A faint frown so slight it was nearly invisible, yet enough to say everything. "Smells like almonds," Bishop said quietly, just loud enough for Casper to hear. And in their world, everyone understood what that scent meant. The room still hadn't had time to understand what was happening when Casper rose to his feet. Delphine reacted faster than anyone. In an instant, her smile vanished completely. The mask fell away to reveal something cold and professional underneath, and the hand that had only moments ago rested lightly on Casper's wrist now slipped into the fold of her silk wrap. But Bishop had already read the movement. "Get down," he shouted, and shoved Casper hard to the side just as the lights in the banquet hall went out. Darkness swallowed 300 people whole. Screams burst open. From the rear gate, exactly as the scrap of plan Marin had seen had warned, 3 black-clad figures rushed in, their guns already loaded. The first shot tore through the last remnants of music. Marin fell flat to the floor among a forest of panicked legs, both hands over her head, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe, while the world around her shattered into broken pieces of sound, glass breaking, tables overturning, someone calling Casper's name in the dark. Casper's men reacted almost at the same time. The guards scattered around the room drew their weapons, and within seconds, the lavish banquet hall became a battlefield controlled by men who had been doing this too long to panic. This wasn't a long gunfight. It was fast, clean, and ruthless. Bishop dragged Casper down behind an overturned table as a shield, covering his boss with his own broad back, the gun in his hand firing toward the dark figures with the cold accuracy of 20 years of experience. One attacker went down, then the second, but the third had managed to break away, circling to the right, searching for a clear angle straight toward the place where Casper was hiding. Marin, from where she lay close to the floor, was the only one who saw him raise his gun and aim at Casper's turned back. She didn't have time to think. She only had time to scream a warning that tore through her throat. Bishop heard it, and in that brief, life-and-death instant, the cold man who had stood behind Casper for his entire life did what he had always done. He lunged across and shielded Casper, taking the bullet directly into his side. The gun went off. Bishop froze. Then he folded forward, one hand clutching his side, blood seeping through his fingers and spreading across the white shirt. The last attacker didn't have time to fire a second shot before one of the guards took him down. The lights came back on with sudden brutality, exposing the whole ruined room. the trembling guests pressed against the walls, 3 strangers lying motionless on the floor, and Bishop Crane on his knees in a widening pool of blood. Casper caught him, and for the first time in many years, something raw and human appeared on the face of the crime boss that never changed. Bishop looked up at his boss, the corner of his mouth twisting into a crooked smile, and whispered that the girl had been right. "Don't drink that glass." Then his head dropped against Casper's shoulder. He was still breathing, but faintly, and the sound of people calling for an ambulance rose in chaos around them. In the midst of all that confusion, Delphine had used the darkness to retreat toward the side door, almost reaching the exit, but she hadn't accounted for the fact that Casper's men had been trained to lock down every way out the moment trouble broke loose. 2 guards stopped her at the threshold. The small gun hidden in her wrap was stripped from her hand, and the breathtakingly beautiful woman still wearing her glittering engagement gown was pinned in place, every escape route slammed shut. Marin slowly stood in the middle of the wrecked room, the wine on her face long since dried, and when she lifted her head, she met Casper's gaze across the chaos, the man holding his blood-soaked, loyal right-hand man looking at the maid he had almost failed to believe, with a look she had never seen from anyone before. Bishop was rushed into emergency care as the ambulance siren tore through the night, and after the horrified guests had been escorted away from the scene in an orderly manner by Casper's men, Casper stepped into the small room at the back of the mansion where Delphine was being held. The sleeve of his suit jacket still streaked with the blood of the man who had just taken a bullet for him. He didn't shout. He didn't strike her. He simply pulled out a chair, sat across from the woman who was supposed to become his wife in 9 days, and looked at her for a long time with eyes that had returned to their usual coldness, though deep beneath it, something had just been cut open. He asked her only one question, his voice low, and even in a way more frightening than any scream. Was anything in the past 2 years real? Delphine lifted her eyes to him, her perfect makeup now smeared, and for the first time since Marin had known of this woman's existence, her face wore no mask at all. She let out a soft laugh, bitter and exhausted, and then she told him, not to beg for mercy, but as though she were finally being allowed to set down a burden she had carried for too long. She said she belonged to Sabatini, that she had been planted in his life from the very first meeting he had believed was accidental 2 years earlier, that every smile, every touch of her hand, every night lying beside him had been part of a meticulously planned mission meant to bring her close enough to end him at his most vulnerable moment, in the middle of the party that should have been the happiest night of his life, so a message could be sent to the entire underworld that the Hale Empire could be erased from within. Casper sat motionless and listened, not a single muscle in his face moving, letting her speak until there was nothing left. Then Delphine's voice sank, and this was the part that made the whole story more bitter than she had expected. She admitted that there had been a time, she didn't even know when it had begun, when she had started to hesitate, that on those nights when she watched him sitting alone in that vast room, she had caught a glimpse of a lonely man instead of a target, and something she wasn't allowed to feel had begun to kindle inside her, enough to make her delay, enough to make her almost want to stop. But she had gone too far, owed Sabatini too much, had become a person for whom no road back existed, and that hesitation was only enough to torment her, not enough to save her, because in the end, she had still allowed the poisoned wine to be poured. "It's too late now," she said softly, almost to herself, and in that moment, the woman who had once coldly set a trap for a crime boss looked strangely both dangerous and pitiful. Someone who had lost the ability to tell the difference between the role she was playing and who she truly was a long time ago. Casper stood. Every law of the world he lived in told him he should finish her right there, because a betrayal of this magnitude had no precedent for mercy, and no one in the underworld would blame him if Delphine vanished from the earth that very night. But he didn't do it. He looked at her one last time, the woman who had slept beside him for 2 years while he had never truly known her, and instead of drawing a gun, he ordered his men to hand her over, along with all the evidence, to the federal authorities who had long been quietly investigating Sabatini's network. It wasn't pity, he told himself that, because killing her would turn her into a martyr in Sabatini's eyes, while letting her live and collapse, stripped of every useful value, locked away like a failed pawn, would be the bitterest ending of all. But deep inside, in the place he didn't allow himself to look, perhaps it was also the last shred of honor speaking, that fragile line reminding him that he didn't want to become exactly the kind of monster both Delphine and Sabatini believed he was. After Delphine had been taken away, and the mansion sank into the heavy silence of a place that had escaped death by only the narrowest margin. Casper sat alone in his study with an untouched glass of liquor, and his mind didn't turn toward the traitor who had just left his life, but back to the maid being kept in another room inside the house. Because the naked truth that his world imposed on every situation was this: Marin Whitlock now knew too much. She had witnessed an assassination plot, had seen the faces of the attackers, had heard Bishop mention the poison, had stood at the very center of an event that no outsider should have been allowed to survive and tell. According to the cold logic that had kept him alive for so many years, a witness like her was a breach, a risk, a loose thread that could unravel the whole cloth if it fell into the wrong hands. And in the underworld there was only one way to handle loose threads: cut them away before they could do harm. The instinct forged inside him through decades of betrayal and blood spoke clearly and without hesitation. It told him that allowing a strange girl to carry that many secrets beyond these gates would be a mistake no man in his position was allowed to make. That gratitude was a luxury men like him couldn't afford. He had given orders far more ruthless than that for reasons far smaller. But this time, when he tried to summon that familiar decision in his mind, something stopped it. A resistance he didn't know and didn't like, because in all his life, Casper had never met a person who risked their life for him without hoping for something in return. Everyone around him served some equation of benefit: loyalty bought with money, fear maintained by threat, even those closest to him staying, because they had calculated the cost of leaving. Yet that maid, a small person with nothing to gain, someone whose act of speaking carried only danger and promised no reward at all, had chosen to tell the truth when silence would have been 1,000 times easier and safer. She didn't know he would reward her. She couldn't have known whether he would believe her or order her thrown out. She had stood among 300 people, taken a full glass of wine to the face, and still opened her mouth to say something that could have cost her job, her freedom, even her life, for one single reason that Casper's calculating mind couldn't fit into any category, because it was the right thing to do. The idea was so foreign to him that it unsettled him more than the barrel of a gun aimed at his face. He didn't believe in unconditional goodness. He had buried that belief with his childhood a long time ago, and the existence of someone like Marin directly challenged the worldview that had kept him alive, forcing him to face a question he didn't want to ask: that if selfless goodness truly existed, then perhaps the cold fortress he had spent all these years building around himself wasn't the only way to live. He didn't allow himself to trust her too quickly. Trust had killed too many people he had once known, so instead of ordering her dealt with, and instead of letting her go, Casper chose the middle road of a suspicious man. He had his people quietly investigate everything about the maid named Marin Whitlock, digging deep into her past, her family situation, every connection, every possible hidden motive, to see whether the goodness he had just witnessed was real, or only another elaborate disguise in a world where he had learned that nothing ever came for free. He kept her at the mansion under the name of protection, telling himself he was only being cautious, while not yet realizing that the fact he had hesitated to act against her was already an answer he wasn't ready to admit. The report on Marin Whitlock was placed on Casper's study desk after only 2 days, thinner than he had expected but heavier than he had imagined, and as he turned each page beneath the desk lamp, the suspicious worldview he had prepared to use in searching out every crack began to fracture in a way he hadn't foreseen. There was no hidden motive at all, no connection to Sabatini or any rival power, no sophisticated disguise for him to peel apart. There was only the naked story of a young woman carrying a weight no one her age should have had to carry, a crushing hospital debt, a younger sister with a damaged heart, night shifts piling one on top of another, a life wrung dry drop by drop, just to keep one small life beating. Casper read the section about her sister again and again, and a strange feeling began to crawl up the back of his neck, a vague recognition not yet fully formed. The name of the hospital in the file, the timing, about 1 year earlier. Something brushed against his memory like a piece finding its way back to where it belonged. He called someone in and ordered them to pull the records of the charity foundation he had quietly maintained for years. The foundation almost no one knew existed, used to pay urgent medical bills for patients who couldn't afford care at a children's hospital. He silently sponsored, one of the very few things he did without profit, without image, a small corner where he had kept some remnant of the person he had been before. This world turned him into what he was now, and when the list was brought to him, when he traced line after line of names until his finger stopped, He sat in silence for a long time in the dark study. About 1 year earlier, before Marin had ever set foot inside this mansion, before the name Whitlock had meant anything to him, the emergency treatment and intensive hospitalization for a 15-year-old girl with a heart defect had been paid in full by his foundation in a single night, a decision he hadn't even made directly, merely one case among hundreds approved through the hands of the people who managed the fund, a nameless figure on a long list. That girl's name was Posey Whitlock. Casper closed his eyes. He, a man who didn't believe in fate, a man who had built his whole life on the belief that everything in this world was transaction and calculation, suddenly found himself standing before a coincidence so vast it no longer felt like coincidence at all. He had once unknowingly saved the life of the younger sister of the girl who, nearly 1 year later, would save his, and neither side had known it. Marin had no idea that the employer she had come to work for, the man she had risked her life to warn, was the nameless hand that had kept her sister alive through that fateful night. And she herself didn't know that the unusually high wages that had drawn her to this house, the job where no one had asked about her background, might have been arranged by something larger than both of them. In that moment, something inside Casper's windowless fortress shifted, not shattered, not yet. But one brick had loosened from the wall that had seemed impossible to move. He didn't tell her what he had discovered. He didn't tell anyone, but from that second on, the reason he kept Marin in the mansion changed in nature, though he himself didn't yet dare give it a name. On the surface, the reason remained a cold and legitimate truth. Sabatini hadn't been arrested. And now that the assassination plan had failed, the old man wouldn't leave behind any witness who could expose his network, which meant Marin and Posey were both now within the reach of a man willing to kill in order to silence people. Keeping her there was to protect her. That was what he told himself. But deep beneath that reasonable excuse, for the first time in many years, Casper Hale kept someone close, not because she was a risk that had to be controlled, but because some part of him, the part he thought had died, couldn't bear the thought of letting her walk out there alone. In the days that followed, Marin remained in the mansion under the name of protection, and during that strange stretch of time, when Bishop was brought home to recover after the surgery to remove the bullet from his side, she began doing something no one in this house had ever expected. She cared for that man, not because anyone ordered her to, but because she saw a human being in pain and didn't know any other way to be present except by helping. She changed his bandages, brought hot porridge up to his room, sat with him when he woke in the middle of the night because of the pain, and Bishop, a man who had spent his whole life standing behind someone else, was cared for by someone for the first time without calculation. And little by little, he stopped looking at her with the wary eyes of a bodyguard, and began looking at her as a rare, kind soul who had somehow wandered into their world. It was through those moments that Casper began to observe Marin in a different way. He noticed the way she treated everyone in the mansion, from the gardener to the girl who cleaned the kitchen, with an equal respect that the people living in silk and velvet around him had lost a long time ago, and he realized she didn't change her manner depending on whether the person before her was a bodyguard or the most powerful boss in Chicago. To her, he wasn't Casper Hale, the man the whole city feared. He was only a human being, and she treated him exactly that way. One evening, she found him sitting alone in the great kitchen after midnight had long passed, and instead of withdrawing the way her invisible habits had taught her to do, she did something no one dared do. She asked whether he had eaten dinner. Then, without waiting for an answer, she searched the cupboards for simple ingredients and cooked him an ordinary meal, the warm, humble kind of food born in poor kitchens, setting it before a man accustomed to $1,000 banquets, who had never once had someone cook for him simply because they cared. Casper looked at that plain plate of food for a long time before picking up the spoon. And in the silence of the late-night kitchen, something between them began to shift. They talked, hesitant and fragmented at first, then gradually more openly in the safe darkness of those late hours. He didn't tell her about the empire or the blood, and she didn't ask. But through his silences and a few careless words, she came to understand the terrible loneliness of a man who owned everything yet belonged to no one, and he caught a glimpse of the weight this small young woman had quietly carried for years without ever complaining. She told him about her mother, about what she had once taught her, that a person's worth didn't lie in what they had, but in how they treated someone who couldn't give them anything in return, and that simple sentence stayed in Casper's heart longer than he wanted to admit, because it touched the fragile line of honor he had silently kept, without ever naming it. He realized that his whole life he had treated people like pieces on a chessboard, measuring their value by how useful they were. And this girl, without preaching or judging, simply by the way she lived, was quietly showing him another measure. She didn't try to change him, didn't try to save him. She was simply herself, and that was what carried the greatest force against a wall built from suspicion. What Maren didn't know was that while she quietly warmed the long nights inside the mansion, Casper had silently done something he never told her about. He had his people contact the best cardiologist in the region, arranged an appointment, and took care of the entire cost of the surgery Posey had waited far too long to receive, not as a reward to purchase Maren's loyalty, and not so she would be grateful to him, but because for the first time in many years, he wanted to do something right for someone without needing anything in return, exactly as she had done for him on the night when she had nothing to gain. That quiet closeness grew night by night, and one evening it gathered into a moment neither of them had prepared for. They were sitting late in the study again, an early season rain tapping against the tall glass windows, and when Maren bent down to place a cup of tea on the table beside him, her sleeve accidentally brushed across his hand, and they both went still. Casper looked up, and at a distance so close, she could clearly see the faint scar along his cheekbone. Something stretched between them like a thread about to snap, a bare and dangerous pull that both of them had tried to ignore for days now laid open without concealment. He lifted his hand, his fingers almost touching her cheek, the very cheek that had taken the full splash of red wine on the fateful night, and for 1 second the whole world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for that final distance to close. But then Maren stepped back. She retreated 1 step, her breathing uneven, and turned her face away, because in the middle of that fierce pull, reason had cried out a truth her heart didn't want to hear. This man, the one who had remembered her name, who had taken care of her sister, who had allowed her to see the loneliness behind his shell of ice, was also the head of an underworld built on fear and violence, a man whose hand, the one that had nearly touched her face, had once given orders she didn't dare imagine. She thought of her mother, of the values she had taught her about right and wrong, and she wondered what kind of person she would become if she allowed her heart to lean toward a man like him. Guilt and longing tore through her until it hurt, because she couldn't deny that she had begun to feel something she wasn't allowed to feel, and she couldn't forgive herself for it either. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I can't." And she left the room, leaving behind a man sitting motionless in the dim light. Casper didn't follow her. He sat there for a long time, and for the first time in his life, the cold fortress around him didn't give him the familiar peace it always had, only emptiness. He understood why she had stepped back, and the frightening part was that he couldn't blame her, because she had seen him exactly as he was, without decoration, without illusion, and had still chosen to retreat. The change in him didn't come like lightning, it slipped in quietly, and it showed itself most clearly a few days later, when one of his men brought him news about someone who had betrayed the organization's trust, then placed on his desk the familiar question of dealing with him the way they had always done. Before, Casper wouldn't have needed even 1 second to make the decision. Cruelty had become reflex to him, but this time he sat still, and in his mind, uninvited, came Maren's words about a person's worth lying in how they treated someone who couldn't give them anything in return, and he found himself hesitating for the first time in many years, before a violent decision that should have come easily. He ordered it handled another way, a way without bloodshed, and when his subordinate left with his surprise carefully hidden, Casper remained seated with a new unease, because he realized the girl who had refused him was changing him from the inside in a way no power, no enemy, and no bullet ever had. And that made him want her even more, and fear it at the same time, because in his world, a man who allowed himself to soften was a man who exposed a weakness, and he knew better than anyone that his enemies were always waiting to find exactly that weakness. The fear of an exposed weakness became real faster than Casper had imagined, because Sabatini, after the failed assassination plot and Delphine's fall into federal hands, didn't sit still and accept defeat, but immediately began hunting for the only loose thread left, the maid who had ruined every one of his calculations. It didn't take him much effort to discover that the girl had a younger sister, and that this sister was the softest, most vulnerable place on the entire chessboard. One afternoon, while Maren was inside the mansion, her phone rang from an unknown number, and the cold voice on the other end needed only a few sentences to make her whole world collapse. Posey had vanished from the apartment. The girl was in the hands of Sabatini's men, and the price for buying back her sister's life was that Marin had to come alone to an appointed place, by herself, in exchange for her own eternal silence. Because to Sabatini, killing the maid and erasing the witness was the only way to close the book on his humiliating failure. Marin let the phone fall from her hand. Her legs buckled beneath her, and in that moment she was no longer the calm girl who had stood firm among 300 people. She became again the child who had sat beside a hospital bed watching her mother fade away, the older sister who had spent sleepless nights counting every labored breath her sister took, and the terror of losing the last person she had left in the world swallowed her whole. Casper found her in that state, trembling and white as paper, and when she told him in broken pieces through her tears about the call, about Posey, about the meeting where she was supposed to trade her life, he felt something in his chest tighten in a way he had never known before. She clung to his sleeve. The girl who had once proudly refused him, now collapsing to her knees and begging, pleading with him to help her save her sister, saying she was willing to trade her own life, willing to go there alone, willing to do anything as long as Posey lived. He gripped her shoulders, forced her to look into his eyes, and told her in a firm voice that she wouldn't go alone, that she wouldn't trade her life for anyone, because this was his matter now. In the moment he made that promise, Casper understood exactly what he was doing and how frightening it was. Walking into a trap Sabatini had prepared in order to save a child brought him no strategic benefit. Putting himself in the line of fire for a girl who had refused him, and a young girl he had never even met, went against every rule of survival he had followed his whole life. The Casper of 1 year earlier, even of only 1 month earlier, would have weighed the gains and losses, would have considered whether the lives of 2 strange sisters were worth risking an entire empire, and the cold answer would have been no. But the man standing here now, the man who had been reached in the deepest place he had thought dead by an ordinary meal cooked in a late-night kitchen and a simple sentence about human worth, was no longer that man. He didn't hesitate. He summoned his people, laid out the plan with the cold precision of someone far too accustomed to danger. But this time the purpose wasn't power or revenge. It was to save one small life that had nothing to do with his world. Before he left, he turned back to look at Marin, and in those eyes that had always been cold, there was now something she had never seen before, a silent promise that he would bring her sister home no matter what it cost. She held his hand tightly one last time before he stepped through the door, and both of them understood, though neither said it aloud, that what was about to happen at the docks tonight would decide not only Posey's life, but also the fate of the fragile and dangerous feeling that had just begun to bloom between them. The South Chicago docks at night were a maze of stacked steel containers and sickly yellow lights spilling over the black water, and though Casper had ordered her to stay somewhere safe, Marin couldn't sit still inside the mansion while her sister lay in the hands of death, so she secretly took a dark taxi to tail the convoy from a distance, slipping into the shadows of the container zone unnoticed with her heart pounding as though it might break apart. The exchange unfolded exactly like a trap both sides knew was a trap. Sabatini appeared with his men, and Posey, small and trembling, was held between 2 men, her face white as paper, but her eyes still brightened when she saw her sister. Casper stepped forward first, calm and cold, drawing out the conversation long enough for his men to move into position in the darkness. And the moment Sabatini signaled to his men, everything erupted at once. The first gunshot tore the night open. Casper's men closed in from the hidden corners, and the docks turned into chaos made of muzzle flashes and the clash of metal. In the middle of that chaos, one of Casper's men managed to pull Posey out of the circle, pushing the girl to run toward the darkness where Marin was hiding, and the 2 sisters crashed into each other in tears. But in that exact moment, overwhelmed with emotion, Marin stepped out from her safe hiding place to gather her sister into her arms. Sabatini, realizing he had lost and determined to drag down the girl who had ruined him, caught sight of her and raised his gun, aiming straight at Marin as she held her sister. Casper saw it, and he didn't have even 1 second to weigh the choice. He lunged forward, crossing the exposed space between 2 lines of fire, and shoved Marin and Posey down behind a block of containers just as the gun went off. This time, no one stepped in front of him. The bullet sank into Casper's body. He staggered, one hand clutching his chest, then collapsed onto the cold concrete. Almost at the same time, his men took down the last of Sabatini's gunmen, and Sabatini, disarmed and pinned to the ground, looked for the first time in his life like exactly what he truly was, a bitter old man who had lost the entire game, waiting to be handed over to the federal agents, rushing in with red and blue lights flashing through the night. But Maren saw none of that. She saw only Casper lying motionless on the dock, blood spreading beneath the yellow light, and she let go of her sister to rush to his side, her trembling hands pressing uselessly against the wound in his chest. "Don't," she said, her voice breaking into sobs. "Don't leave me. You're not allowed to leave me after all of this." Casper's face was deathly pale, his eyes half closed, and in that terrifying moment, when she thought she was about to lose one more person, every barrier she had ever built inside herself collapsed. She bent down close to his face, her tears falling onto his cold cheek, and she said the thing she had denied for so many nights, that she loved him, that she didn't even know when she had started loving him, that she didn't care who he was in that other world. She only needed him to live. She begged him to stay, repeating that confession again and again like a spell that could hold him to this life. And then, as the ambulance sirens drew near, Casper's ice-cold fingers moved faintly in her hand. His eyes opened a little, clouded with pain but still finding her face through everything, and his pale lips lifted into something almost like a smile. He whispered, his voice so weak she had to lean close to hear it, that the bullet hadn't hit his heart, that he wasn't planning on going anywhere, that he had promised to bring her sister back, and he had never broken his word. Maren broke down crying, this time not from despair but from a relief so vast it made her tremble, and she held him tightly in the ruined docks. Her sister pressed close beside them, three fragile people clinging to one another in the very place that should have become the grave of them all tonight. The months after the night at the docks passed like a slow healing for every wound this story had left behind. Casper survived the bullet, and during the long weeks of recovery, he made a decision no one in the underworld could have expected. Sabatini's arrest had opened a door, and instead of filling the power vacuum the old man had left behind in the old way, Casper chose to cooperate with the federal authorities, providing what he knew to tear Sabatini's network out by the roots, in exchange for an agreement that allowed him to begin dismantling the very empire he had spent years building with blood. It wasn't some miraculous transformation that turned a crime boss into a saint overnight, and Casper would have been the first to laugh if anyone had described it that way. His past was still there, the things he had done couldn't be erased, and he carried them with him like scars that would never fully heal. But he chose a different direction for the days he had left, step by step moving the underground parts of his business into legality, cutting away the pieces that couldn't be saved, not because he had suddenly come to believe in nobility, but because for the first time, he had a reason to want to become a man Maren could stand beside without having to turn her face away. Posey finally entered the heart surgery she had waited for through all of her childhood, performed by the finest doctor Casper had quietly arranged even before the night at the docks, and the operation was a success. Maren sat for long hours in the hospital waiting room, and this time, unlike every time before in her life, she didn't have to carry that fear alone, because there was a man sitting silently beside her, holding her hand when the operating room doors finally opened with good news. As Posey recovered, the heart that had once been so weak now beat steadily and strongly, and for the first time in her life, the girl could climb stairs without having to stop for breath, could laugh out loud without making her sister hold her own breath in worry, and every carefree laugh from her younger sister was the greatest reward Maren had ever dared dream of. As for Maren, the girl who had once willingly become an invisible shadow slipping through gilded hallways without leaving a trace, she no longer lowered her head. She had learned that being quiet didn't mean being invisible, that dignity wasn't something granted by status, but something a person carried within themselves, whether they were wiping tables or sitting at the head of an empire. She didn't become someone else. She simply finally allowed herself to be seen. She and Casper began something slow and careful. Two scarred people feeling their way toward trust, after a lifetime of learning not to trust anyone. There was no lavish wedding, no 300 guests, no white orchids covering a banquet hall, because both of them had already had more than enough of beautiful rooms hiding lies underneath. What they found in each other was far simpler and far more real. Ordinary meals cooked in the late-night kitchen, quiet evenings that didn't need to be filled with words, the steady presence of someone who wouldn't leave. Bishop, recovered from the wound in his side, remained beside Casper, but now more as a friend than a bodyguard, and sometimes he looked at the two of them with the discreet smile of a man who understood exactly what miracle had saved all three lives that night. The man all Chicago had once feared for his cold loneliness finally found the one thing money and power had never been able to buy him. A home, not made of expensive walls, but of two people who chose to stay beside him, when they had no reason to do so except love. And so the story of the maid, who once had a glass of red wine thrown straight into her face before 300 people came to an end, not with revenge or ruin, but with healing and a home built from the smallest things that once seemed almost invisible. If there is one thing Maren Whitlock leaves for all of us, it is the reminder that a person's worth has never been found in the clothes they wear, the work they do, or the balance in their bank account, but in the choices they make when no one is watching, in the courage to speak the truth, even when that truth may cost them everything. We live in a world that too often glances past the quiet people, the servers, the people who clean the hallways, the people who do the work society calls ordinary, and we forget that sometimes they are the very ones who carry the greatest dignity, the sincerest kindness, and the quiet courage that can change an entire fate. This story also reminds us of something gentler, that even the heart that seems coldest, even the person who seems to have lost every ability to love, can still be warmed again by a kindness that doesn't calculate, doesn't demand, and doesn't ask to be repaid. The respect we give one another, especially to those who can offer us no benefit at all, is the truest measure of who we are. If this story has touched your heart in some way, if it has made you remember someone in your own life, or made you pause and think about your own courage, please leave a like. Share this video with the people you believe also need to be reminded that quiet souls often carry the greatest bravery. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that each day we can listen together to more meaningful and deeply moving stories. I would truly love to hear from you. How do you feel about Maren and Casper's journey? And if you had been standing in that room on that night, would you have had enough courage to speak the truth the way she did? Have you ever met someone the whole world underestimated, yet who taught you a lesson about kindness you would never forget? Please leave your thoughts in the comments below, because every story, every feeling you share, may become a warm source of encouragement for someone quietly reading it in the middle of the night. We treasure every sincere line that comes from deep within your heart, because those very things remind us that kindness is still here around us, in the most ordinary people. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story all the way through. I wish you, the person watching this video, abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and calm in every day that passes. See you again in the next stories, where together we'll continue to find more kindness and warmth in this life. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.